All right, guys, we got Ben's C6 Z06 back in the shop today. If you remember from a month or so ago when we were at the track, it's pretty slow compared to where we think it should be. And we're trying to sort out what the issue might be. So today we're starting with the basics, and both Ben and I have a little bit of a concern. He's got a Killer B air intake system on here, and to us that just looks like it's a little restrictive. You know, looks can be deceiving, and I'm all about science if I can. So what I'm going to try to do is we're going to scan it and look at the map pressure and KPA with it in its stock configuration, and then we're going to remove the lid on there, and we're going to try to pry the bottom open a little bit to see if we can kind of get almost a Veraram forced air intake effect and see if we can increase the amount of air going into the motor, which obviously would mean more horsepower. So we're going to do that first, then we're going to get it up in the air, hook up the wideband so we can make sure that what the computer is commanding for fuel ratio is actually what's being delivered. That's super important. So we're going to try to do that today. And we'll be looking at some different shots here as we go along.
Toys for life.
Okay guys, let me get us all on the same page as to why we think something's wrong with Ben's C6 Z06. First off, when drag racing, the mile per hour that you achieve at the end of the quarter-mile track is a well-known indicator as to how much horsepower you're making. Now, it's also affected by the elevation above sea level, the weight of the car, and air temperature. With that in mind, back on race day, Ben's best two runs achieved 121 miles per hour. Now we also get an elapsed time on our time slip as well, and on race day, Ben's best time was 11.85. But unlike mile per hour, elapsed time is heavily influenced by gear ratios, track preparation, driver ability, and traction. So for our purposes, we're essentially going to just ignore the elapsed time, and we'll rely on the mile per hour for judging if Ben's C6 Z06 is putting out enough horsepower. Now that we know that Ben's car traps 121 miles per hour in the quarter, we can compare it against what a bone stock C6 Z06 traps in the quarter mile. And that's pretty easy to do because there's a ton of data out there. And with a 5-minute Google search, I was able to determine that 123 miles per hour is pretty typical for a 2008 C6 Z06, and that's 2 miles per hour faster than Ben's car. Aww. Now normally I wouldn't get too wrapped around the axle over 2 miles per hour, but Ben's C6 Z06 has several tasteful yet powerful modifications done to it, and yet somehow it ends up being 2 miles per hour slower than a bone stock C6 Z06. And so this is the problem that we're trying to solve. And here are the modifications that we are pretty confident Ben's car has from the previous owner. Not a modification, but important nonetheless. The car only has 30,000 miles on it. It has AHP package 4 cylinder heads with Brian Tooley Racing .660 springs and titanium retainers. It has a cam motion cam. Looks to me like a stage 1 variant, coming in at 225, 242 duration at 050 and 118 lobe separation angle. Also has 651 and 652 1,007-inch valve lift. It also has, and I can confirm this for sure, Cook's ceramic coated headers and a 3-inch catted mid-pipe with a Borla attack muffler and custom Corsa exhaust tips. On top of the engine is a Mammo ported and shaved intake. Also has a Mammo ported throttle body. And to put this power to the ground, it has a monster twin disc LT1S clutch to hold all of that power. To me, this seems like a pretty well selected list of parts for a mild build, and in my opinion, this should yield at least 5 miles per hour over stock. But unfortunately, our day at the track disagreed. One thing I've learned through the years when trying to solve a problem like this on a vehicle that you didn't set up yourself is to never assume anything. So we're going to verify everything, even the simple things. So to start our search for the 7 miles per hour that we believe is missing from Ben's quarter mile per hour speed, that equates to about 75 horsepower, by the way. we're going to start with the basics. The good news is that pretty much no matter what you're working on, the basics stay the same. Airflow comes in, it gets mixed to a certain air-fuel ratio and compressed. The spark fires at the right time. It creates power, and then the exhaust gases go out the tailpipe. So let's start by looking at the air intake system on Ben's C6 Z06. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of got that shroud that's tightly sealed really and covers the air intake system. It's clearly there to keep that underhood engine heat from getting to the air intake, but it's also sealed quite well. And if you look inside the cavern in front of the C6 that houses the air filter assembly, visually it looks fairly tightly sealed as well, which makes us wonder if there's enough air coming into that area to feed the mighty 7-liter LS7 beast all the way up to 7,000 RPMs. So rather than speculating or guessing if it's enough air, we're going to use HP tuners to find out. So we're going to leave the air intake system as is. We'll go out and do a wide open throttle pull in second gear from about 2,800 RPMs all the way up to 7,000 RPMs. And then we've got some before data to look at. Next, we're going to modify Ben's C6 Z06 by allowing us to get at some of that cold, high-pressure air that feeds the radiator from the front fascia. We'll do this by prying away the radiator shroud from the chassis. We're just going to insert a couple of 1x1s and secure them in place with some duct tape, and that'll allow us to get plenty of that cold air to the air filter. So now we'll just go back out and do another second gear pull from about 2,800 to 7,000 RPM. And that way we can compare this data with the before data. Alright guys, so what did we learn? Well, first off, you have to understand what ambient air pressure is. It's just atmospheric pressure that's pushing on you at all times, and you don't even know it wherever you are in the United States. If you're up in Denver, Colorado, there will be less air pressure. If you're right by the ocean, there will be more pressure. And here in Minnesota, on this particular day, I turned the ignition on, but the engine is not running, so it's 0 RPMs. And the engine's manifold absolute pressure sensor measured 99 kPa in that situation. Up here in this graph, to make it easier to understand, I've converted this just to pounds per square inch. So the maximum pressure on this particular day at this time was 14.36 pounds per square inch. So that's our ambient air pressure. So I've pegged the 14.36 psi at the bottom of the screen so you can keep that in mind. And this is the run with Ben's Killer Bee intake system as we found it. As expected, as the RPMs increase, it drops off by a little bit of psi, which is the restriction in the air filter assembly. Here is with the wood propping it open. You can see it drops off a little bit less, like 0.15 psi, which in my mind is probably equal to like maybe 3 or 4 horsepower. Just for fun, this is a C5 Corvette with a stock air filter assembly. You can see it drops off a little bit more, but again, only worth a few horsepower. So the conclusion here, in my opinion, is the air filter assembly is not restrictive, and we need to look for another cause to our problem. The next thing we're going to do is perform an exhaust back pressure test on Ben's car. Now, since his car has catalytic converters, even though they're aftermarket, it's entirely possible that at some point in time in the car's history, it had a misfire or other condition that dumped raw fuel into the exhaust system. And running like that can kill a catalytic converter in just a matter of a few minutes. So, lucky for us, Ben's exhaust system has a Cook's intermediate pipe, which also has an extra bung welded into it for an oxygen sensor, or in our case, I've got this bung plug, which I've drilled and tapped, and this plug will receive this copper tubing, which has this adapter fitted to it, which will screw into this plug, and then this copper tubing will go to a pressure gauge, and it's just a vacuum/pressure gauge, which will mount up the side of the car and then into the cockpit so I can hold it and record it in slow motion while we're driving to actually measure the back pressure. Now, just so you know, John Lingenfelter has been quoted as saying anything more than 5 pounds of back pressure, you could probably pick up a little horsepower by reducing it. My C5 Corvette in the past, I've measured it. It's got about 10 pounds of back pressure, so I could pick up a little bit of horsepower on that. And the supercharged Fiero is right around 4 pounds of back pressure, if I remember right. So that's doing pretty good. So let's see how Ben's car tests.
Saying second, right?
Yep.
All right, ready?
Yep. Clearly Ben's exhaust back pressure is perfect, so both his intake and exhaust systems have checked out just fine. Now let's move on to checking the compression on the mighty LS7. Now I highly doubt we're going to find any issues here, but we decided to do a compression check anyway because it's a pretty easy test to do, and I really want to rule out the possibility that somewhere along the line in this car's history, somebody installed the improper length push rods, which could prevent the valves from fully closing, and obviously that would be a big hit to compression and a big hit to performance. Now keep in mind that aftermarket camshafts will typically lower cranking compression, but since Ben's camshaft is pretty mild, I'm expecting just a minor hit to compression, and I would like to see it somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 to 190 pounds per square inch. To perform this test, I like to start with an engine block that's pretty warmed up because that'll close the tolerances up a little bit, and then we simply remove a spark plug and screw the compression gauge hose into the cylinder head. Now when we're doing this test on C5s and C6s, I typically don't have to pull any fuses. All you need to do in this case is make sure Ben's foot is to the floor. That puts the car's computer into clear flood mode, so it will cut the fuel to the injectors and the engine won't start. I like to let each cylinder hit the compression stroke 4 times, and then we'll stop the test and record that final number. We're gonna go ahead and start with cylinder number 4. Go for it. Once we have our number, we simply just write it down and put the spark plug back into the cylinder and move on to the next one. Next, we're going to test cylinder number 5. Fire away. So now that you have the hang of it, if you're doing this test on your own car, just keep going and write the number down each time until you've done them all. So for Ben's car, all of the cylinders we tested were just fine, and they were all within 10% of each other. So this is about what I would consider normal for an LS7 with a mild cam. So far, we still haven't found anything wrong with the Z06, so let's dig a little bit deeper, and this time we're going to hook up the AEM wideband so that we can get an accurate idea of what the air-fuel ratios are under wide open throttle acceleration. To hook the wideband up, we simply tap into the bung that's installed in the cook's midpipe, and we carefully run the cable across the floor and up the side of the Z06 into the cabin where I can connect it to the laptop. Now we're ready to make a pull. So here's the first pull we did. You can see we did it from around 3,300 RPM all the way up pretty close to red line. We went to pretty close to 6,900 RPM. And it's important to note this was with 93 octane, a fresh fill, which is what Ben typically runs in the Z06. And the first thing I like to do is look for knock retard. And as you can see during the entire pull here, the knock retard is at 0. So it's good to know there's no damaging knock that we have to worry about, at least during this pull anyways. Next thing I like to do is look at the air-fuel ratio throughout the entire pull. Here it is in gasoline terms, which the tuner is calling for 12.4 to 1. Convert that to lambda, 12.4 to 1 equals around 8.84 in lambda terms. And this is the AEM wideband oxygen sensor, what is actually reading. And so you can see here at the beginning, it's 0.82. That's about 12.1 to 1 when it's calling for 12.4. So that's a little bit rich at the beginning. But as we get deeper into the RPMs at 4,400, it's about spot on. And up at 5,800 RPMs, it's still pretty spot on. But as we get closer to red line, it starts to get a little richer. This is about 12.2 to 1. Probably like to see this closer to, say, 12.6 to 1. So overall, I would say his air-to-fuel ratio during the pull looks pretty good, a little bit on the rich side. The next time we go to the track, we can probably lean this out a little bit and see if we pick up a few horsepower. but I definitely don't see any smoking gun, as the air-fuel ratio really isn't that far out of whack from what the tuner is calling for. Now, the last thing I like to look at is the timing curve, and you can see down at 3,500 RPM, it's at 21 degrees. And as we go through this and get closer to peak torque, timing drops down to about 17 degrees, which is pretty normal for an LS7. And as we get closer to red line, it goes back up to around 21, 22 degrees. This range is pretty normal for an LS7. And for some of the viewers that might be used to like the old small block Chevys, those called for, 32, 33 degrees. And that was pretty normal, but it's because that head is very inefficient compared to the LS7 head. So the more efficient the head is, the quicker the burn and the less ignition advance you need. So overall, in my view, this timing curve looks pretty normal for an LS7. On this day, we ran out of time to go any further with our search for the missing horsepower. So the next time you see the Z06 in the shop, we're going to add a couple of degrees of timing and see if it likes it or not. If it doesn't, we're going to be prepared to boost the octane rating all the way up to 96 and see if that makes a difference, so you're not going to want to miss that. All of this work we're going through is because it's Minnesota. It'll be cold out soon, and we're probably only going to get one more crack at the quarter mile with the Z06. We're shooting for September 30th, and we've got to make sure we're ready. If you found today's video interesting, please hit that thumbs up below. That's the only way YouTube will know to share it with the rest of the Corvette community. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. And most importantly, thanks for watching.